The wine hit her first. It came in a slow, red arc across the white tablecloth, and then across the front of Katie Mercer's uniform, warm and clinging, soaking through to her skin before her mind caught up with her body. For one suspended second, the whole Aurelio dining room seemed to inhale the clink of silver stopping, the violinist's bow lifting off its string, and Katie stood in the middle of the floor with Cabernet dripping from her chin and did the thing she had trained herself over 28 years to do. She read the room. That was the reflex that had kept her alive through a childhood of being the biggest girl in every class, through years of double shifts and grabby customers and managers who watched the tip jar closer than they watched their people. Before she felt the humiliation, she catalogued the exits. She clocked the manager frozen in the kitchen doorway, already deciding to do nothing. She clocked the 80 diners finding sudden fascination in their plates. And she clocked the table that had done it, the corner banquet, the best in the house, 3 young people wrapped in the kind of money that made waiters lower their eyes. "Oh no," the first one said. "A young man in a watch worth more than Katie earned in a year. You spilled my wine, sweetheart." He picked up a dinner roll and threw it. It bounced off her collarbone. The woman beside him, diamonds at her throat. Boredom in her eyes, flicked a spoonful of risotto that struck Katie's cheek and slid down, and the table erupted in that particular laughter, the kind that came only from people who had never once been on the receiving end of it. The third one, a lean man, leaning back with the ease of someone who had never been told no, said the thing Katie would remember for years. "On your knees. Clean it up. That's what you're for." And the reflex, the terrible, ancient reflex, began to bend her knees. Because the manager was watching and doing nothing. Because dignity had always been a luxury other people got to keep. Because somewhere far back, a heavy girl had learned that survival meant swallowing, and swallowing had kept her alive. So Katie Mercer, wine soaking through to her skin, risotto in her hair, began to lower herself toward the marble in front of 80 people who were all very carefully looking away. She never touched the floor. That's enough. The words were not loud. That was what stopped her, not volume, but temperature. They came from the small table by the window, spoken by a man who had not risen, who had not even turned fully in his chair. He simply set down his fork, with a small, precise click against the china, and let those 2 words fall into the room like stones into still water. The effect was instant and total. The laughter died. Katie looked up, half-crouched, and found him watching the corner table with the flat, unhurried attention of a man deciding something. He was tall, even seated, dressed in black, cut to his body by someone who understood him, and there was a terrible stillness to him, the stillness of deep water over great depth. He did not look angry. That was the frightening part. He looked the way a surgeon looks at a chart. The maitre arrived at his elbow the way a man arrives at a car crash. Signore Falco, his voice cracked on the name. Falco. The word moved through the room like a dropped current. Katie didn't understand it yet, but she felt its shape in the bodies around her, the way the wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables suddenly needed their coats, the way the manager physically retreated into shadow. She only knew that the 3 people who had been laughing 10 seconds ago had gone very, very quiet. Cristiano Falco still had not raised his voice. He picked up his wineglass, considered it, and spoke to the young man with the watch, conversationally, almost gently. "Do you know," he said, "the last time I saw your father, we discussed a shipment that went missing off Red Hook. He was very upset. He kept apologizing." A small pause. It was difficult to watch a grown man apologize like that. To beg, really. I remember thinking, I hope his children never have to learn to do that. The young man's face had begun to change color. "And here you are," Cristiano continued, throwing bread at a working woman, making her crawl for your amusement. "In public, where anyone might see and remember it." He set the glass down. "You understand that when I make a phone call tonight, and I will make it, your father is not going to defend you. He's going to be very quiet on the line. And then he's going to ask me what he owes me for the inconvenience. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He hadn't threatened anything. He hadn't named a single consequence. And that was worse because it let their own imaginations do the work. And the imaginations of people raised in those families were very well furnished with things to fear. The woman in the diamonds made a small sound. "I would apologize now," Cristiano said, to all 3 of them, "while it's still worth something to me." Her name, his eyes moved, unhurried, to the name tag pinned crooked on Katie's ruined uniform is Katie. I'd use it. They did not have to be told twice. They did not have to be pushed to the floor. They came down on their own, the woman first, folding into the marble in her couture with mascara running, then the lean man, jaw working, then last, shaking, the young man with the watch, three heirs of three of the most powerful families on the eastern seaboard, kneeling on the floor of the Aurelio not because anyone forced them, but because the alternative, whatever they imagined it to be, was so much worse. "I'm sorry, Katie," the young man whispered into the floor. And Katie Mercer, who had been made small her entire life, who had learned to expect nothing and be grateful for less, stood over three people bowing to her and felt something crack open in her chest that she had thought was sealed shut forever. It was not triumph. It was something more dangerous. It was the feeling of being seen. She lifted her eyes to the man who had done it and found him already looking at her. And for one long, impossible moment, something moved behind his ice there and gone before she could name it, a flicker of something that looked absurdly like recognition, as though he had seen her before, as though he was looking at a ghost. Then it sealed over. "You're finished for the night," he said to her. Not a command, a fact. His gaze slid to the manager in the doorway. "She's finished for the night." Of course, Mr. Falco, of course." Katie's hands were shaking too hard to untie her apron. She looked down at the three people still on the floor, and then at the man who had put them there without lifting a hand, and she understood that she had just watched something she was not meant to survive knowing about. Cristiano picked up a clean cloth napkin from the empty chair beside him. He held it out to her, not to a waitress, not to a woman on her knees, but across the small distance between them, so that she could wipe the wine from her own face standing up, with her chin level. "Go home, Katie," he said quietly. "This won't follow you." He was wrong about that. But she believed him, because she wanted to, and because no one had handed her anything in a very long time. She didn't sleep. She sat on the fire escape of her walk-up in Washington Heights with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and replayed it until it stopped feeling real. Men like that did not defend women like her. That was the physics of the world she lived in. Beautiful women got defended, thin women got defended, and Katie got risotto in her hair and a manager who studied the tip jar. So why had he looked at her like he knew her? She made the mistake, at 2 a.m, of typing the name into her phone. The results turned her cold. Cristiano Falco, reputed head of the Falco organization, questioned in connection with never-charged persons of interest, who declined to testify. Investigation closed for lack of. The executioner, that was the word beneath the articles, in the true crime forums, in the careful language of people who did not want to be sued or worse. The most feared man in New York, a man whose enemies did not go to prison. They simply stopped being anywhere at all. And he had made 3 of the city's richest heirs beg on a restaurant floor because someone threw bread at her. Katie set the phone face down on the rusted metal and hugged her knees and told herself she would never see him again. That it had been a whim, a story too strange to tell, a door that had opened for 90 seconds and closed. The black car was waiting outside her building the next morning. It wasn't a threat. That was the strange part. The driver, an older man with tired, kind eyes and a shape under his jacket she made herself not look at, rolled the window down and said, "Miss Mercer, Mr. Falco wanted to know you got home safe. And he'd like to buy you breakfast. You can say no. He told me to make sure you knew you could say no." Every rational cell in Katie's body said no. But there was the memory of the napkin held out level, and the way he'd said her name is Katie to a room that had never bothered to ask. And there was the debt, always the debt. $140,000 with her dead mother's name on it. The reason she worked doubles until her feet bled. And there was the fact, which she was ashamed of, that for 90 seconds last night she had been the most visible person in a room instead of the least. She looked at the driver. "If I say no, then I drive away and you never see any of us again." He said it plainly. "That's the whole offer, miss. No trick in it." She believed him. She got in the car anyway and hated herself a little for it, and did it anyway. That, she would think later, was the truest thing about her, not that she was fearless, but that she had never in her life been able to stop herself from stepping toward the thing everyone else stepped away from. He'd emptied a cafe for it, a small one on a quiet block, cleared of every other customer, which frightened her more than a crowd would have. He rose when she came in, actually rose and pulled out her chair, and Katie sat across from the most dangerous man in New York in the flat grey morning and could not find a single word. He poured her coffee himself. "You looked me up," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Good. You should know who's buying your breakfast." She studied him. Up close, in daylight, the ice looked less like arrogance and more like exhaustion, the face of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Any of it. You don't know me." There it was again, the flicker. He looked at her a beat too long, and she had the disorienting sense that he was choosing between two answers, and that the true one cost him something. "I don't like watching cruelty go unanswered," he said finally. "That's not the whole reason." His eyes came up. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Are you going to tell me the rest?" No. She should have been afraid. Instead, she found herself, absurdly, almost smiling. "Then I'll tell you something," she said. "The debt at Mount Sinai, my mother's. If it goes away, I'll know it was you, and I'll pay back every cent. And it'll take me 11 years, and I'll do it. Because I don't owe people. I got out of owing people a long time ago, and I'm not going back in for anyone. Not even a man who can make 3 rich kids beg without standing up." Something moved in his face. Not offense, something closer to interest, as if he had reached for a woman he could rescue and touched. Instead, a woman who would not be rescued, and found the second thing far more compelling than the first. "Understood," he said quietly. The debt at Mount Sinai vanished 11 days later. Marked paid, anonymous benefactor, no name. Katie called the billing office 3 times to be sure. Then she went home and cried, once hard, out of something that was not gratitude and not relief, but closer to grief, because the weight she had carried since her mother died had defined her, and she did not know who she was without it. And then she wiped her face, opened a notebook, and began working out how many extra shifts it would take to pay back $140,000 to a man who did not want it back. She meant every word of it. That was what he could not have anticipated. Cristiano Falco had spent his life among people who took. He had no defense at all against a woman determined to give it back. What Katie didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 2 years earlier, on a rain-slick loading dock in the Bronx, a heavy-set young woman coming off a double shift had seen a girl being dragged toward a white van. Everyone else on that street had looked away. Katie hadn't. Katie had screamed and thrown her whole considerable weight against the van door and jammed her forearm in the gap and bought 30 seconds of chaos, long enough for the girl to twist free and run, long enough for the men inside to decide the screaming waitress was more trouble than she was worth. Katie had never learned the girl's name. She'd gone home with a bruised arm and a thin cut that scarred and never told a soul, because who would she tell, and what was there to say? The girl's name was Elena Falco, and her brother had been looking for the woman who saved her for 2 years. He didn't tell Katie. A debt he could simply repay was a debt that ended, and Cristiano Falco, who had lived his whole life certain that nothing good stayed, was not, it turned out, ready for this to end. So he did smaller things. He learned the cafe near her apartment where she liked to read on her one morning off, and he began, occasionally, to be there. He never engineered it, obviously. He was simply present, with 2 coffees, and after the 3rd time, neither of them pretended it was chance. Those mornings became the thing. She learned that he had raised his sister alone from the age of 19, after their father died the way men in his family died. She learned that he read history obsessively dead empires, mostly the ways powerful things fell apart. She learned that he had not laughed, a real laugh, in longer than he could remember, and that she could sometimes surprise one out of him, and that when she did, he looked briefly like a much younger man, and then looked away as if she'd caught him doing something forbidden. He learned that she had put herself through 2 years of nursing school before the money ran out and her mother got sick, that she remembered the name of every regular at the Aurelio and their orders and their children's birthdays, because being invisible had made her an extraordinary noticer of other people, that she was not soft the way he'd first assumed softness and size went together. She was one of the least soft people he had ever met. She had simply chosen, against all the evidence of her life, to keep being kind. He found that he could not stop thinking about it, the sheer stubbornness of it. Kindness held on to by someone the world had given every reason to let it go. His hand rose once, across the cafe table, as if to brush a strand of hair from her face. It stopped halfway, hovered, withdrew. Neither of them mentioned it. Both of them thought about it for days. The first warning came at the 8-week mark, and it did not come to Katie. It came to Cristiano, in the form of a question asked at a sit-down he could not refuse by a man he could not simply make disappear. The question was polite. That was what told him how much trouble he was in. "The waitress," said Don Marco Vitelli, folding his old hands on the table. Vitelli was 70, soft-spoken, with the mild face of a retired schoolteacher and eyes like 2 cold coins. His son had been one of the 3 on the floor at the Aurelio. "You humiliated 3 families over a waitress, Cristiano. My boy came home and couldn't eat for a week. I'm not angry, a father understands. A young man needs to learn. But I confess I'm curious. A man like you doesn't spend that kind of coin on a whim." A pause, gentle as a knife, going in slow. "Who is she to you?" "No one," Cristiano said. "A whim, like you said." Marco Vitelli smiled, and it was a genuinely warm smile, and that was the most frightening thing in the room. "Cristiano," he said kindly, "you've never done a thing on a whim in your life. That's why you're still alive." He rose, an old man moving carefully. "I'll find out on my own then. Don't trouble yourself." Cristiano did not sleep that night, and it had nothing to do with a photograph. The photograph came 3 days later. It was left on Katie's new doormat she'd let him move her, finally, to a building with a doorman, one of the few gifts she'd allowed, and only because it was safer, and safety was not the same as owing. It was a long lens shot of her, grainy, taken from across the street. A single white rose lay across it with its head torn off. She didn't call him crying, she called him steady, which was worse, because he could hear the effort in it. "Someone was outside my building," she said, long lens. "They wanted me to know they'd been watching. Cristiano, what did you drag me into?" He was there in 11 minutes, and when he saw the photograph, the ice did not crack. It froze harder, down into something that made even his own men, watching from the hall, go still. "Pack a bag," he said. "Tell me what this is first. The families I embarrassed for you have been asking who you are. One of them stopped asking me and started asking the city." He looked up, and there was something in his face she had never seen, not fear for himself, but a kind of horror at himself. "I did this. I put a light on you in a room full of people who never forget an insult, and I told myself it wouldn't follow you home. That was a lie I wanted to believe. I'm sorry. Pack a bag." Katie did not move. "If I run," she said slowly, thinking it through the way she thought through a bad shift, "I'm running for how long? Forever? I have a job. I have a life I built out of nothing. I am not going to spend it hiding in a box because you decided to defend my honor. You'll spend it alive." "Don't," her voice cut. "Don't you dare use that on me like I'm a child who can't count the cost. I've been counting the cost of everything since I was 9 years old. You want me to go somewhere safe? You tell me the truth. All of it. Why me? Why you'd start a war over a stranger?" She stepped closer to him, this small, furious woman with wet eyes and a level chin. "You've been looking at me like you know me since the second you set down that fork. I want to know what you know." For a long moment, he said nothing. His men had gone. It was only the 2 of them, and a torn rose and a photograph. "Not here," he said finally, and something in his voice had changed. "I'll tell you, but not here. Somewhere they can't reach you while I do." The safe house was a converted lighthouse on a lonely stretch of the Connecticut coast, stone and storm glass, and the endless grey heave of the Atlantic. For 2 days they were alone in it, Cristiano, who did not sleep, who walked the windows like a man walking the walls of a fortress, and Katie, who watched him and slowly understood that the most feared man in New York was afraid, and that the thing he was afraid of was her being gone. She did not let him hide inside the danger. She cooked because there was food and she could not sit still, and because feeding people was the one language of care she'd never been ashamed of. She made him sit at the small table and eat, and she asked him questions, and the storm walls in him came down 1 stone at a time. He told her about the night their father died and the morning he became, at 19, responsible for a frightened 12-year-old girl. He told her What it had cost to keep Elena innocent inside a business built on the opposite of innocence, the lies, the two lives, the way he'd learned to become winter so that one person in the world could stay spring. She's why, Katie said quietly, on the second night. The power had gone out with the storm. They sat by a fire he'd built, and the sea threw itself against the rocks below. Everything cold in you. It's all wrapped around keeping one warm thing warm. He looked at her across the fire, and something in his face broke open. There's a scar, he said, on your left forearm. Katie went still. You've had it the whole time, he said. I saw it the first night, at the Aurelio, when you started to kneel. That's Katie. That's the moment I stood up. Not the bread, not the wine, the scar. Her hand went to her arm, to the thin white line she'd carried for 2 years, and never explained. 2 years ago, Cristiano said, and his voice was not steady now, not at all. A man named Marco Vitelli tried to take my sister off a loading dock in the Bronx, to hurt me. She was 17. The ransom call never came. For 3 days I tore this city apart, certain I'd find her body. He stopped, swallowed, and then she walked back into my house, half-starved, shaking, and she told me a woman had saved her. A big woman, coming off a night shift. The only person on the whole street who didn't look away, threw herself at the van, screamed, jammed her arm in the door and cut it and wouldn't let go, bought Elena the 30 seconds she needed to run. His eyes were wet. Elena never got her name. She was too frightened to look back. I've spent 2 years looking. Every diner, every double shift within a mile of that dock. A debt I couldn't pay because I couldn't find the person I owed it to. The fire cracked. The storm howled. Katie could not breathe. And then, Cristiano whispered, I walked into a restaurant for a meeting I didn't want to take, and I watched a woman get bread thrown in her face, and she started to kneel, and I saw the scar. He shook his head slowly, like a man still not believing it. It was you. It was always you, the woman who saved my sister and vanished before I could even say thank you. And there you were on your knees. And not one person in that room, not one was going to stand up for you the way you stood up for her. Katie understood then, all of it at once. The napkin, the debt, the mornings with the coffee, the near touch that stopped halfway. He had not been paying a debt. A debt could be paid and closed, and he had never once, in 2 years, wanted it to close. You could have just told me, she said, her own voice breaking. That first morning, you could have said thank you and paid me and let me go. Yes. Why didn't you? He looked at her for a long moment. This man who commanded rooms with a single word, and now seemed to have run entirely out of them. Because then it would have ended, he said, and I found that I could not. He stopped, started again. I have tried to walk away from you every day since that restaurant, Katie, and I cannot do it. I know what I am. I know what my hands have done. You deserve a life that isn't this. But every time I decide to let you go, I think about a woman throwing herself at a van for a stranger's sister, and I understand that you are the only genuinely good thing I have ever gotten close enough to touch, and I become a coward about it. So, no, I didn't tell you. I'm not proud of it. Katie stood. She crossed the small stone room, and she put her hand, her ordinary, scarred, capable hand against his jaw, and felt the tremor run through a man who had not trembled in 20 years. I didn't save her for a reward, she said. I want you to know that. Not for money, not for you, not for any of this. I did it because someone had to not look away. Her thumb moved along the sharp line of his cheek. But I'll tell you what I won't do. I won't be a debt you're paying off. I won't be the good deed you're rewarding. If you want me to stay, you don't get to keep me safe from behind a wall. You have to let me in. All the way in. Wall down. I don't know how, he admitted. It might have been the first time in his life he had said those words aloud. I know, Katie said. Neither do I. We'll be bad at it together. When he kissed her, it was not the kiss of a boss or an executioner or the most feared man in the city. It was the kiss of a man who had spent 2 years searching for someone and had found her on her knees on a marble floor and had finally stopped pretending he was searching for anything else. Outside, the storm broke against the rocks. Inside, for the first time in either of their lives, neither of them was alone. Marco Vitelli found the lighthouse on the 4th night. He did not come loud. Men like Vitelli never did. Katie woke to Cristiano's hand over her mouth and his voice, a breath in her ear. They're here, and the world tilted from warmth into terror in the space of a heartbeat. He had known this was possible. He had prepared. But there is a difference between preparing for a thing and living it, and Katie learned that difference in the next 40 minutes. Learned it in her bones, in the copper taste of fear flooding her mouth. There were too many of them. She understood that immediately. From Cristiano's face in the dark, the specific, controlled grimness of a man doing the math and not liking the answer. He had 2 men at the lighthouse. Vitelli had brought 8. The old Don had waited, had watched, had chosen his moment with a patience that was itself a kind of cruelty. The power died first. Then the shooting started. Katie did not scream. Some cold, clear part of her, the part forged in 100 bad nights, took over and made her useful. When Cristiano pushed her down behind the thick stone base of the spiral stair, she did not freeze, she thought. She had spent hours cooking in this lighthouse, learning it, and she knew things he didn't have time to remember. That the gas line to the old kitchen still ran live, that the fuse box was in the base of the tower, that the whole ground floor could be plunged from bad dark into total black with one pull, and that men who did not know a building were far more afraid of the dark in it than men who did. The fuse box, she hissed at him, catching his sleeve as he moved to cover the door. By the stairs. If I kill the emergency lights too, they're blind. You know this place. They don't. He looked at her, one sharp, startled look, and she saw him recalculate, saw the math change. Stay low, he breathed. Count of 3, then go dark. Then don't move until I come for you. Promise me. Go, she said. She waited, heart slamming, until she heard his first shot draw their fire to the far side of the room. Then she went low, fast, invisible, for once grateful to be a woman the world overlooked, and she reached the fuse box and pulled every switch her hand could find, and the lighthouse dropped into absolute black. The change was instant. The shouting turned confused. Men who had been advancing with confidence were suddenly blind strangers in a stone maze, and the one thing moving through that maze with certainty was Cristiano Falco, who had walked these stairs 100 times and did not need his eyes. Katie pressed herself into the cold stone and listened to the most feared man in New York become the name they'd given him. It was not glamorous. That was what she carried afterward. It was ugly and close and terrible. And when the muzzle flashes lit the room in strobing white, she saw his face, and it was not cruel. That was the thing that undid her later, alone, in the quiet. His face was grieving, the face of a man doing something he hated because the alternative was her. And then, near the end, it almost went wrong. Marco Vitelli had not come blind. The old man had brought a light of his own, and when the last of his men fell, he found the fuse box and threw the emergency lights back on, and the ground floor filled with a sick red glow, and there was Katie, exposed, pressed against the wall not 10 feet from him. He was hit. Cristiano had reached him. But he was old and full of a 2-year hatred, and as he went down he raised his gun, not at Cristiano, but at her, at the woman who had cost him everything on a loading dock 2 years ago, and cost him everything again tonight, at the nobody waitress who had unmade his family twice. There was no time. Cristiano was turning too far, too slow, his face opening into pure animal terror. And Katie did the only thing her body had ever known how to do. She did not run. She had never once in her life been able to run from the thing everyone else ran from. She threw her whole considerable, unglamorous, magnificent weight against the old man's arm, the same weight she'd thrown against a van door 2 years before, and the shot went wide and shattered 100 years of lighthouse glass instead of her skull. And then Cristiano was there, and it was over. For a moment, there was only the sea, and the wind through the broken window, and Marco Vitelli slumped against the wall, disarmed and finished, staring at Katie with an expression she would never forget, not hatred now, but a kind of dazed wonder. You, the old man said, blood at his mouth. You're the one, from the dock. A terrible, wet laugh. All this time. A waitress. He shook his head. I hunted a ghost for 2 years. And she was serving lunch on the Upper East Side. His eyes found Cristiano's, and something passed between the two old enemies, some grim professional understanding. She threw herself at the van, Vitelli said, almost admiring. My men couldn't believe it. Nobody does that. Nobody's that stupid, or that brave. I never knew which. Both, Cristiano said. His voice was wrecked. She's both. When it was truly over, when the coast had gone silent but for the water, when the men who could be sent away had been sent, Cristiano crossed the wreckage of glass and blood and knelt in front of Katie. He took her face in both his hands and checked her over, inch by inch, desperate, a man cataloguing a miracle, and when he found she was whole, that not one drop of the blood on her was hers, something in him that had been frozen for 20 years, finally, completely shattered. You threw yourself at him, he said. His whole body was shaking. You could have died. You could have died, Katie. Why? Same reason as last time. She was crying and laughing at once, coming apart in his hands. Somebody had to not look away. He pressed his forehead to hers, and the most feared man in New York wept silently, wholly, in the ruins of a lighthouse, holding the only person who had ever thrown herself into fire for a falco and asked for nothing in return. I can't do this world without you, he said into her hair. I've tried to decide you'd be safer far away from me. I keep deciding it. And then you pull a fuse box in the dark and save my life, and I understand I was never going to be able to let you go. Not from the first morning, not from the scar. Then don't, Katie said. Wall down. Remember? Wall down, he agreed, and it sounded like a vow, because it was. Marco Vitelli did not die that night. That, in the end, was Cristiano's choice, and it was a more frightening choice than the other one would have been. The old man was sent home, broken his power, quietly stripped, his son's shame made permanent, his family's standing folded into the Falco name without a single further shot fired. In that world, it was understood. Some debts are collected slowly, in full view, as a lesson. Marco Vitelli spent his remaining years as a cautionary tale told at other men's tables. Do you remember the Don who hunted a waitress? Do you remember what she cost him? The families who had once knelt at the Aurelio understood the lesson perfectly. Katie Mercer, they learned, was not to be touched, not to be watched, not to be spoken of. She had become, without ever asking to be, the single most protected person in the city, protected not only by the executioner's guns but by his reputation, which did more work than any gun ever could. She kept her job for another 4 months, out of pure stubbornness, until the Aurelio's owner sold the restaurant to a holding company that mysteriously insisted she be made manager. She turned it down. She used the leverage instead to finish her nursing degree, because being invisible had made her an extraordinary noticer of pain, and she wanted, at last, to do something with it that was hers. Cristiano never once suggested she do otherwise. He had learned the one lesson that mattered, that Katie Mercer could not be rescued, only loved, and that the difference was the whole of everything. They were married the following spring, in a small stone chapel within sight of the lighthouse, on a clear day with the sea calm for once and gold. Elena Falco was the maid of honor. She was 19 now, luminous, healed, and when she saw Katie for the first time in the chapel, when she finally, after 2 years, laid eyes on the woman who had thrown herself at a van door and then vanished into the city, she did not shake her hand. She crossed the aisle and folded Katie into her arms and wept into her shoulder, and said the thank you her brother had spent 2 years unable to deliver. I looked for you, Elena whispered. Every day. I couldn't even give him your face. I'm so sorry it took so long. You found me, Katie said, holding the girl she'd saved without ever knowing it. That's the only part that matters. You found me. At the altar, Cristiano watched the 2 women who had reshaped his entire life fold into each other, and the last of the winter went out of him and did not come back. Later, after the vows, after the small crowd had gone and the candles burned low, he found Katie at the chapel window, watching the sea turn dark. You know what I keep thinking? She said, not turning. The night you made them beg, I thought that was the strangest thing that would ever happen to me. The most powerful man in the city, standing up for a nobody waitress. She smiled at the glass. I never imagined the truth was stranger, that I'd already stood up for you first, 2 years before either of us knew the other existed. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her and rested his chin on her hair. I made a whole room bow to you that night, he said quietly. The richest people in the city, begging, saying your name into a floor. And you know what I understood later? it still wasn't enough. It could never be enough, because you'd already done the one thing not one of them would ever have done, for a stranger, in the rain, expecting nothing. His arms tightened. You didn't look away. Katie turned in his arms. She looked up at the man the whole city feared her impossible husband, the executioner who had handed her a napkin held level so she could keep her chin up, and she smiled. And it was the smile of a woman who had spent 28 years certain she was invisible, and had finally, at last, been seen all the way down. "Neither did you," she said. Outside, the lighthouse turned its slow gold beam across the darkening water, around and around and around, sweeping the coast, like something keeping watch, like a promise, like a man who would let the whole world burn before he ever again let anyone make her kneel. And in the warm dark of that little chapel by the sea, for the first time in either of their damaged, dangerous, extraordinary lives, neither Cristiano Falco nor Katie Mercer was alone. The lighthouse turns its slow gold light across the water still, keeping watch over two people who spent their whole lives alone and finally aren't. Because in the end, Katie was never saved by the most feared man in the city. She was simply seen by him, the way she once saw a frightened stranger in the rain, and refused to look away. That's the quiet truth beneath all of it. The kindness we give expecting nothing has a way of finding its way home. If Katie and Cristiano earned a place in your heart tonight, leave a like so this story can find the next person who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and share it with someone who's ever felt invisible in a crowded room. And tell me, if you'd been at that table, would you have been the one to stand up? The end.